So quick recap of last session, we covered the arguments from translations, and our conclusions were important. They were that critics don't have a unified theory of origin for the Book of Mormon. This is significant because most of them rely on Joseph having access to outside materials, but some do not. So in addressing them, you have to address multiple, and actually weakens the critical case. If there was a strong critical case, they should coalesce around one way in which the Book of Mormon was developed. So we only looked at the I guess more prominent one nowadays that's mentioned in the CES letter. We showed all the different materials that they argue Joseph Smith could have had access to. And we talked about, first, that's contrary to all the evidence that we have. All the evidence says from the 6 eyewitnesses that he did not have any materials, that he had his head in his hat looking at the stone to translate. So despite having zero evidence for the theory, we next looked at, well, even if they're correct, even if Joseph had access to every material they say that he did, that actually doesn't do anything for the critics, because they do not address the 8 hours of material that we covered of complex correspondences between the text and between history, geography, in Arabia and in Americas that need explaining, right? So every hour we'd go through material and I'd say, look, we need a rational, a naturalistic explanation for this. How did he know about Bountiful? How did he know about Nahum? How did he know about this, that, and the other? This is what needs to be explained. And so I actually showed every element that Joseph could have pulled from these sources that he hypothetically had. And even if you say, grant you, he has access to all of these things that we showed, it doesn't actually explain what needs to be explained. And that's the biggest problem that I have with the critical argument, is that there needs to be a naturalistic argument that actually addresses the elements that are surprising to us and that we find in the text. We covered next the book of Abraham, just briefly because we talked about it in the last session. We talked about how, again, the majority of the critical arguments are against the facsimiles, and we talked about why premises and suppositions based on the facsimiles are very difficult. And then we said, look, no one has addressed the text of the book of Abraham, the most important aspect of the book, and given us a naturalistic explanation for all the correspondences that we presented when we talked about the book of Abraham, and the texts that have come forth since Joseph Smith gave us that book that correspond with Abraham. And we have no critical argument addressing those at all. We next went to the book of Enoch, and I said that we don't even have any real criticism of the book of Enoch. The critics have ignored it, despite the fact it's the most susceptible to testing. Finally, we finished with the Kinderhook plates, the little plates that were found out to be a hoax, and we talked about a really interesting way in which Joseph could have tried to secularly translate those plates. So we talked through, those are the biggest things, right? The translation of the Book of Mormon and everything else that he gives us. And I find the critical arguments to be entirely lacking. We're now moving into arguments that are even more attenuated from LDS truth claims. And so we're going to talk about arguments from the first vision and priesthood restoration. Our sources, a couple of the critical sources, and of course CS letter, but nothing new from there. Grant Palmer's is probably your best bet for that. In terms of primary documents, Opening the Heavens is really good. It's accounts of divine manifestation of 1820, 1844. So all it does is correlate every known account from all of Joseph's revelations. So we'll use that a bit. And then Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling. Again, not the only. There's tons of biographies, but a good one of Joseph Smith, so we'll look at that a bit. All right, so some preliminaries. The first vision, it's not really an LDS truth claim, right? The LDS truth claim is what we talked about. Joseph Smith possessed plates, which the Book of Mormon is a functional translation. This is what can be tested. This is what we can test via the text itself, witnesses, on and on and on. The first vision is a claimed personal experience with no witnesses. There's no claim of authority given. We'll go to priesthood restoration, which includes witnesses. So this is a personal theophany of Joseph Smith, and it wouldn't matter if there were not subsequent visions. No one would care about the first vision if there was not subsequent vision, if we didn't have the Book of Mormon and on and on and on. This wouldn't matter. There were plenty of people that claimed visions of Jesus at that time and before and since, so it wouldn't matter. And therefore, whether or not it happened is only testable by reading the different accounts provided by Joseph and then testing them against each other for inconsistent statement, right? We've talked about how we impeach a witness through inconsistent statement, or perhaps the historical record for historical consistency. So, again, it's very difficult to test because it's a personal experience with no claimed witnesses, and B, it wouldn't matter if we didn't have future vision. So just understand this as we get into arguments from the first vision. So the first argument is going to be based on the historical record. Here's how it goes. Premise A, Joseph Smith left at least 4 different accounts of his vision. Premise B, these accounts all claim that, quote, religious excitement around Palmyra in 1820 was a catalyst for his spiritual concerns. Premise C, there was no revival in Palmyra in 1820. Premise D, therefore Joseph was lying about this in his accounts, or lying in these accounts about the catalyst for his spiritual concerns. If Joseph was lying about the catalyst for his spiritual concerns, he must be lying about the vision itself. As our conclusion, therefore, Joseph Smith never had a vision as claimed. This is your most prominent actual criticism about this supposed excitement or revival of 1820. This is the most prominent one that you'll find. When did this start? This first started in 1967. Reverend Wesley P. Walters claimed that, quote, no revival occurred in the Palmyra area of western New York State in 1820. So he rejected all reminiscent accounts by Mormons and made this assertion because of a, quote, alleged massive silence about such a revival in documents written or published during that year, either newspaper accounts, diaries, or whatever. Instead, he argued, quote, the statement of Joseph Smith Jr. cannot be true when he claims that he was stirred by an 1820 revival to make his inquiry in the grove of trees near his home. This is 1967 when this first comes about. So Walters insisted that various evidence showed that Palmyra having no revival from the fall of 1817 until 1824. This is when you get the big revival that actually is post-Alvin's death, that actually Joseph conflates in some of his accounts. We'll get to that. So thus Smith allegedly invented a fictitious revival to support his allegedly fictitious first vision of a deed in 1820 by superimposing on that year the extensive revivals which contemporary sources clearly describe for Palmyra in 1824 and the following year. So we do clearly have documentary evidence of 1824 and 1825. So this is what Walter said happened, right? That Joseph made up 1820 so that he could superimpose his first vision, of course, because he has Moroni coming in 1823, so he's got to fit that first vision in there. So in 1995, a biographer wrote, quote, there was no significant revival in or around Palmyra in 1820, adding that, quote, no known revival occurred in Palmyra between 1818 and 1823, right? Just parroting what we get from Walters and repeating no revivals in or around Palmyra. This is exactly what you get in the CS letter. He just quotes. So my point again, we've talked about this number of times when I was first given this document and I said, there's nothing new here. It's been happening for decades, right? This has been happening since 67. So this is just manifestly incorrect according to the historical evidence. There was actually 4 waves of Palmyra's revivalism, each with differing intensity and significance. The first was in 1816 to 1817. This is, of course, in 1801 there was a huge one where you have about 1,000 converts to Methodism, but that's prior to Joseph's family moving to the area. 1816 to 17, we have the first series of interdenominational events of various sizes, already in progress when young Joseph arrives in Palmyra with his mother and siblings during the winter of 1816 to 1817. In 1818, we have a second wave of revivalism, which is minor compared to the previous one. There's a Methodist camp meeting in June of 1818 that led to Joseph's spiritual inquiry and Bible reading at about the age of 12, which we read about in his accounts. So this is from a published diary of Minister Aurora Seeger. It's commenting on this revival. Is in June of 18. I received on the 18th of June a letter from Billy blah blah blah. On Friday the 19th of June 1818, I attended a camp meeting at Palmyra, nearly 14 miles from Phelps. The arrival of Bishop Roberts, who is soon to be a man of God. Blah blah blah. On Monday, at Palmyra's camp meeting, the sacrament was administered. and on and on. So we have a published account of this camp meeting in 1818, which again is post 1817, when our friend Wesley Walters is claiming that there's nothing happening between 1817 and 1824. This three-day Methodist camp meeting occurred almost exactly 6 months after Joseph Smith's 12th birthday. Recall what he says about what's happening at about the age of 12. My mind becomes seriously impressed, this is all his language, so that's where the errors come in, with regard to the all-important concerns for the welfare of my immortal soul, which led me to searching the scriptures, right? So this is right around that time of this 1818 meeting. Now, as a side note, in 1969, BYU religious professor Milton Blackman made Mr. Walters aware of this diary entry, and he should have recognized that it demonstrated a fundamental flaw in part of his argument. However, he never acknowledged his document, and furthermore, in a 1980 article where he claimed to have read the entire manuscript which summarized the above entry from Seeger's diary, Walters ridiculed the Mormon author's assertion that Palmyra's revivals of 1817 continued into 1818. Right? So he was made aware of the document and never acknowledged it. So when I talk about being frustrated with some critics that aren't really in mainstream scholarship, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's difficult to deal with folks that for 40 years repeat something that in 1969 someone was made aware of, right? The first time, fine, you're not aware of everything, but when someone makes you aware of something that critically harms your argument, you ought to recognize that. And when you don't, it's frustrating to debate or talk with someone like that. So in 1820, we get the third wave of Palmyra's revivalism that led to Joseph's theophany. And that year's camp meeting was also significant development for local Methodism. We actually have numbers showing that their rates increased by 2,000 members that year in that district, not just in Palmyra, but in the district that concluded that. So Palmyra's weekly newspaper edition of the 28th of June, 1820, referred to an out-of-town visitor, a James Kozer, who died on June 26th, the day after he drunkenly left, quote, the campground, following the evening services of, quote, a camp meeting which was held in this vicinity. The Palmyra Register's next edition denied that its editor intended to, quote, charge the Methodists with selling alcohol at their campground while they professedly met for the worship of their God, right? So what do we get here? They're not telling us that a camp meeting occurred, because these things are regular. What are they? The only thing that's interesting about this particular one is we get someone that dies, right? And then the Methodists get angry because they think that the paper is charging them with selling alcohol, so they have to deny that they were actually making that accusation. So critics have asserted that there was no 1820 revival, since no local revivals or camp meetings are reported in the press at that time. So while that's technically true that the Palmyra Press didn't report on the camp meeting, it mentioned the camp meeting in reporting that one of the camp meeting attendees had died from alcohol intoxication. So this particular meeting actually occurred after the dating of Joseph's vision, right? You notice it was June of 1820, and we typically date his vision to early spring, which was in April. But the point of it is that, however, that it demonstrated that camp meetings in themselves were too common to be considered news. So simply scanning the newspapers of Palmyra and then declaring that nothing happened is not sufficient evidence to prove that nothing was happening. Camp meetings were frequently occurrence in the environment, and they were just not reported on unless something cool happened, or like not necessarily cool. So 1819 to 20, there's revivals in 7 towns within the radius of 25 miles of the Smith farm. You notice when Joseph talks about it, he says this area. He doesn't say Palmyra. So the other issue, again, of just scamming Palmyra's newspapers and declaring that nothing's happening is that he's saying this area. And within 25-mile radius, we get we get revivals all throughout the state of New York, with increase among Baptists, Presbyterians. I told you that in 1820 nearby towns, a total increase of 2,256 Methodists in Western New York as a whole just for that year, which is a significant increase for the population of that time. Finally, we get to 1824 to 1825. This is the last of these waves, and this is an extensive series of interdenominational events that were marred, in Joseph's view, by sectarian competition for converts and by the Presbyterian conversion of his relatives, right? So this is a major wave here. So some scholars continued to deny there was a religious revival in 1820 because Joseph Smith's most detailed narration about the pre-vision revival, and then commentaries by his mother Lucy, and by the scribe Oliver, referred to circumstances about the 1824 to 25 revival as being the pre-vision revival. So, such as that it occurred after the death of Alvin Smith, who died in November of 1823, the preaching of Methodist minister George Lane, and then the expansion that includes the Baptists and Presbyterians. So, naysayers conclude that Joseph's dating of the crucial revival in 1820s was, quote, anachronistic, right? Because he's talking about things that happened in the 1824 to 1825 revivals. So he's certainly conflating events. This is from D. Michael Quinn, who's I think a superb historian. He was a member of the September 6th that was excommunicated. He still calls himself, he's a practicing homosexual, he still calls himself a believing Mormon. He doesn't agree with the church's stance on homosexuality and some other things, but he is actually a very well-known and very careful historian. I'm going to quote from him. Merging, conflating circumstances from similar events that happened years apart will certainly confuse the historical record and will perplex anyone trying to sort out basic chronology. Nonetheless, conflation of actual circumstances from separate events is not the same as fraudulent invention of events that never occurred. Conflation also is not the combination of an actual event with a fictional event. Instead, it is very common for memoirs and autobiographies to merge similar events that actually occurred due to the narrator's memory lapses or his or her intentional streamlining of the narrative to avoid repeating similar occurrences. So our conclusion on premise C that there was no revival in Palmyra in 1820 is unsupported by the historical record. Like I said, the amount of ink that's been spilled on this topic since 1967 is tremendous. I mean, this is the one thing that has fixated critics and then proponents alike. They've battled back and forth about. So when you talk about the first vision with people, this is a primary sticking point, which shouldn't have been, except for Walter's 1967 mistakes. So again, from Michael Quinn. Oh yeah.
How would you contrast a revival with normal, regular religious activity? I know that there are several churches there that date back to early 1800s. So
yeah,
Methodists,
Methodists when they first baptized like 100 people in 1801, that's when they first had to build a church. So you're right. So there would have been services happening.
So what's the definition of a revival and how do you contrast it with just...
That is really hard to know because you have preachers on circuit as well coming through. And so I don't know how you would. When Joseph talks about it, he talks about religious excitement.
Yeah.
So it's something out of the ordinary. So something different from just a particular meeting, a group of meetings, a time when people are joining the faith in numbers. That's what we see. So when we talk about the waves, we're talking about significant numbers coming in to be baptized. So 1819 to 20, we have 2,000 in just the area of New York. So it's an increase in activity. Or it's a series of meetings. 3-day camp meeting 1818. That's not a normal service. That's more of a revival type experience. A 3 full day 3 meeting. Where it's not a normal Sunday service. So it's those type of things that are abnormal, longer meetings, and or lots of people joining a particular faith.
And do those churches there have any baptismal numbers for that period of time?
Yeah, I just showed the 18. Yeah,
compare with other non-revival.
Yes. Yeah, and like I said, if you want to get in, there's so much written on this particular topic because it's been such a big thing that if you want to get into it, there's been actually really good research on all those numbers, and this article actually here is by D. Michael Quinn. I'd recommend that. He goes in depth into the numbers and how they're keeping records and are they making mistakes. I mean, he does a really good job with it.
There was an increase in baptismal activity in the churches during that time period.
Yeah. Okay. People have called this the burned over district. This has been called the burned over question because it's been ongoing since '67. I think it's again not super helpful, but like I said, you can read more there if you're really interested in this specific topic of a revival in 1820 or not. Was there something of excitement happening that could have piqued Joseph's religious curiosity? So D. Michael Quinn says that for narrative flow, Joseph combined 4 different kinds of religious awakening within the Smith family. For overall simplicity, he dated this multi-year conflation as 1820. While this is partially inaccurate, I see it as streamlining his narrative and not as an example of fraudulent invention. This is not privileging Joseph's narrative. It is in fact acknowledging a general pattern in all autobiographies. A repeatedly published handbook for historical research explained that, quote, not all discrepancies signalize a myth or a fraud. In autobiographies, for instance, one must be prepared to find errors in dates and names without necessarily inferring that the account is false. It would be absurd to disbelieve the main fact simply because the date is 2 years off. So I want to move on from this particular burned over question and talk about a counter argument. So critics of the LDS foundations like Grant Palmer or Vogel have argued that Joseph Smith crafted this account in the 1830s to bolster his prophetic bona fides. Right, he's got the Book of Mormon out, and he needs to fashion something more to give him more bona fides. So, so rather than experiencing it at the dawn of the 1820s, this is a fictionalized account from the 1830s. So from the C.S. letter, right, this is what he argues. No one, including Joseph Smith's family members and the saints, had ever heard about the first vision for 12 to 22 years after it supposedly occurred. The first and earliest written account of the first vision was written 12 years after the spring of 1820. There's absolutely no record of first vision prior to 1832. So this is what they're arguing, right? It's made up 12 years after the fact to bolster his credentials. So the test is this. These are two radically different understandings of the first vision. And they should lead to radically different predictions about how well Joseph Smith's first vision account will align with the events of the early 1820s. So on the first, the believing view, Joseph's narrative should match the 1820s context in some detail. Right? On the second, skeptical view, his narrative should match the claimed 1820s context poorly or only superficially. Right? If you're making something up in the 1830s, you'll miss details. It won't match really clearly what's going on in the 1820s. So if he's created his first vision for ecclesiastical purposes in the 1830s, you ought to closely reflect the concerns of the church at that period. But if it came out of the early 1820s, it ought to closely reflect the family culture and other conditions that dominated his youthful experience, right? He was not a church leader at this time. He was a member of this family at a particular time and place. So there's a counter-argument. Joseph Smith's account of his vision fits the cultural and his personal family situation in the 1820s in at least the following ways. We talked about the general religious excitement of the 1820s. That was the first question. We're going to go through economic circumstances, his prophetic development, family work context, and then a number of things in the family religious context. Concern for his immortal soul, his seekerism, reading his Bible, praying in the woods, never before trying to pray vocally and having a vision of Christ. And I'm going to argue that it's probable that Joseph is related an experience from the 1820s because it fits the context of the 1820s very well. So first, the economic context. Here's the claim, right? In one of his accounts, Joseph referred to himself as one, quote, doomed to the necessity of obtaining a scanty maintenance by his daily labor. All right, this is how he described himself in his account. And again, by the 1830s, he's not really farming anymore. He's moved on to his ecclesiastical duties. But this is how he talked about himself. So what's the context for that? Joseph Smith's early life financial conditions were shaped by three disasters. First, we have the swindle by his father's business partner that swallowed his father's inheritance. Remember the ginseng story. Second, we have the 1816 eruption of Mount Tambora, which plunged the world into a protracted winter. The following year was known as the year without a summer. Global disaster became a family disaster. So the Smiths' crops failed. It resulted in being called the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. So rampant crop failures raised the reality of starvation for many people. That actually what forced them to leave Vermont for Palmyra, right? At the edge of the Palmyra. They finally, after a year in town, they are, for the first time in 15 years, able to get on a farm, which they rent, right? After the catastrophe of having to sell the farm back with the ginseng crop, with his father's failed venture, which was actually a swindle. But so they start over, right, and they have to turn what one family member called a forest of the densest timber he'd ever seen into farmland. Right, so this is rooting, not just cutting down trees, but pulling roots out of trees, or pulling roots out of the ground. So between 1819 and 25, they succeed in cutting timber from 60 of the 100 acres. And they developed this cleared land into fields, meadows, garden, orchard, permanent home site, and building lots. So Don Enders had estimated that by the time of the first vision, they would have cleared 5 to 10 acres of timber. Lucy Mack places that number around 30. So what's the conclusion, right? In the wake of, quote, the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world, in the midst of farm foreclosures, if you look at the Palmyra newspaper of that time, you have numbers of notice of farm foreclosures of the country's first Great Depression. There's perhaps never a time in American history before or since when the insecurity of farm life was more evident. It's during this time that the young Joseph Smith, with his fathers and brothers, were making their way through this farm forest, pulling roots out, and watching their father labor without ever seeming to get ahead, right? They're still in debt, they're still in trouble. Would the boy have felt, quote, doomed to the necessity of attaining a scanty maintenance by his daily labor? This is from an author who says, how could he have felt otherwise? This account accurately reflects the conditions of his life as a mid-teenage boy and the feelings that would have gone with them. How about prophetic development? This is really interesting. Historians, when they look at the early life of Joseph Smith, they'll generally begin with him already have taken on the role of seer. So they'll begin at like 1821, 1823, right, where he has a seer stone, and he's starting to, find people's lost stuff, or he's looking at, he's being able to accurately describe stoles, barns, without ever seeing them before. And they'll plunge you immediately into his doing of seer activity. So they'll tell you what he did in that role. The question of when and how he acquired the gift is never really examined, and this goes for even someone like Bushman. Non-Mormon physician William Purple reported an 1826 testimony by Joseph dating his use of the seer stones to 3 years earlier, so 1823. So in this account, he also tells how he got that first seer stone. On this account, Joseph had the, quote, gift of seeing and a seer stone chosen for him by 1821, right? So by 1821, we have a first documented account that he's got a seer stone and he's got this gift of seeing. In Joseph's vision of his seer stone, he reportedly was, quote, greatly surprised to see but one thing, which was a small stone a great way off. It soon became luminous and dazzled his eyes, and after a short time it became as intense as the midday sun. That's really interesting language. Right? It's his first reported vision of his seer stone not only occurred near the time of the first vision, right, maybe shortly 6 months, 9 months after, it also provided a kind of visual echo of that vision, right? This idea of the light he sees growing brighter and brighter until it matched the noonday sun. So in narrating the event, Joseph says, quote, when the light rested upon me, right, I saw two personages. The light enabled him to see God. So like Moses, he's transfigured in God's glory, he's able to see him. So perhaps Joseph's gift as a seer can be traced to this transfiguration. Having his body and specifically his eyes touched and thereby transfigured by God's glory gave him the gift of seeing. Here's an 1893 account. So it's a late account by John Alger. Remember, John is Fanny's brother. So we talked about Fanny Alger, right? His first contracted plural wife. So this is John, her brother, 1893 over in Utah, right? So in 1893, Charles Walker attended a testimony meeting one Sunday where John Alger said that he was a small boy when he heard Joseph Smith, quote, relate his vision of the Father and the Son. That God touched his eyes with his finger and said, Joseph, this is my beloved Son, hear him. As soon as the Lord had touched his eyes with his finger, he immediately saw the Savior. Walker and others, then they go up and question John after the meeting. And Charles Walker says, he told us at the bottom of the meeting house steps that he was in the house of Father Smith in Kirtland when Joseph made this declaration, and that Joseph, while speaking of it, put his finger to his right eye, suiting the action with the word so as to illustrate and at the same time impress the occurrence on the minds of those to whom he was speaking. So he's giving this account of the vision in a small, non-public setting, right, at Father Smith's house, and he gives them this detail we actually don't find in any other account of the first vision. It's very interesting, though, because it's a familiar pattern, right? So we have him translating these documents, and Abraham, he gives us this. Abraham says, and he said unto me, my son, and his hand was stretched out, behold, I will show you all these. And he put his hand upon my eyes, and I saw those things which he had made. So we have this same actual story happening to Abraham, where God touches Abraham's eyes, and then he's able to see all things. We also have Moses 6:35, and the Lord spake unto Enoch, and said unto him, anoint thine eyes with clay, and wash them, and thou shalt see. And he did so. So this is not this is a familiar pattern, right, of a touching of the eyes, giving then a seer-like ability. So the conclusion is that Joseph's account of the first vision in 1820 fit as a starting point of his gift of seeing, right? In fact, the first vision actually provides the best explanation for how Joseph Smith first took on the power and role of a seer. So it fits that context of his prophetic development, because by 1821 he's got the stone and he's starting to. So how about family religious context? So he said he's concerned for his immortal soul, right? At about the age of 12, we already read this. My mind became seriously impressed with regard to all the important concerns for the welfare of my immortal soul. William Smith gives us this. He says, "My mother was a very pious woman and much interested in the welfare of her children both here and hereafter. She made use of every means which her parental love could suggest to get us engaged in seeking for our soul's salvation." Right? How about his claim of seekerism? Seekerism is one who is held aloof from the existing churches, seeking for the restoration of primitive Christianity. Right? So he tells us he's going in there he's pretty much a seeker at this point. He certainly leaves with this attitude, right? How does this fit the context? So Joseph's mother reports that from about 1812 forward, her husband, Joseph Smith Sr., had been, quote, much excited about religion, but would not subscribe to any particular system of faith, but contended for the ancient order as established by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and his apostles. Joseph's father also had been a seeker for some 8 years prior to the first vision. She actually tells us about a vision of Joseph Sr. where he's walking in the barren wasteland, and the spirit that's accompanying him says, "This is the world, it's devoid of true religion," essentially. Joseph's uncle Jason Mack, before he attained his 16th year, became what is termed a seeker. He held that there was no church in existence which held to the pure principles of the gospel, but labored incessantly to convince the people that by an exercise of prayer, the blessings and privileges of the ancient disciples of Jesus might be obtained and eventually would be. So Joseph is very much at home, right? When his mother joins a church, he stays with his father as a seeker, right? So he's very much in his family context as a seeker. How about his claim that he was reading the Bible? He reports that he entered the grove to ask God which church was true, of course, after reading James 1:5. Lucy reports that she had decided early in her adult life, some 20 years before the first vision, to, quote, examine my Bible and take it as my guide to life and salvation. She said she pursued this course for a number of years. John Stafford, who was a Smith neighbor, just a year older than Joseph, recalled that the Smiths had school in their house and studied the Bible, adding that they did not have any teacher, they taught themselves. So his claim of reading the Bible is very much in context with his mother and with the family practice. How about his claim about praying in the woods, right? Lucy records that in the early 1800s, a moment of distress over her husband's spiritual condition, she retired to a grove not far distant where I prayed to the Lord on behalf of my husband. And then describing events of the late 1820s, Lucy refers to, quote, a little grove where it was customary for the family to offer up their secret prayers. So it's likely that the family began to pray in Joseph's sacred grove, and this became their customary grove. So that would be, very rational that once he'd seen God the Father and Jesus there, that it would be a natural place for them to go and offer prayers. Mormons now go to what we think is the sacred grove, and we pray there and we commune there. So it would have been very reasonable to do this. So the idea that he prayed in that grove in the 1820s and that became a family tradition, again, fits the context of their family. How about this claim? I never yet has made the attempt to pray vocally. Here's the context for that. Morning and evening family prayer became a custom in England during the Protestant Reformation, when it largely eclipsed the morning and evening observance of the Mass. Right? So instead of going to the Mass, if you're a Protestant, you have family prayer in the morning and the evening. Fathers were expected to take the lead in family prayer. So William Smith says, we always had family prayer since I can remember. I well remember Father used to carry his spectacles in his vest pocket, and when us boys saw him feel for his specs, we knew that was a signal to get ready for prayer. And if we did not notice it, Mother would say, William, or whoever was the negligent one, get ready for prayer. My father's religious habits were strictly pious and moral. I was called upon to listen to prayers both night and morning. My parents, father and mother, poured out their souls to God, the donor of all blessings. So notice here, many of us have a tradition of family prayer, but it is our tradition normally to call on a family member to pray. You notice William is very specific about who was praying. It was the father and the mother, and they were called to listen to prayers, not to pray themselves. So does it fit the context where Joseph said that he had not yet ever attempted to pray vocally? It does fit their personal family religious context. And again, finally, he of course claims to see the resurrected Jesus Christ. And in her memoir, Lucy Mack Smith reports her own inspired dreams and also her husband's inspired dreams, particularly a series of dreams that ended in 1819, shortly before the first vision. Joseph's grandfather, Solomon Mack, had experienced a vision of light. His aunt Lovisa, prefiguring Joseph's own experience, had seen Christ, quote, incompletely as if through the veil. That's how she described it. So this was a family that was accustomed and open to visionary experiences, right? When Joseph had it and talking to his family, this isn't something where if your kid came home and claimed this, you would maybe doubt deeply. They were a family that this fit their context. So this is my argument, a counter-argument, that Joseph Smith's account of his vision fits really tightly and neatly the cultural and his personal family situation in the 1820s, not the 1830 context of him as an ecclesiastical leader. It fits the general religious excitement that we covered, his economic circumstances, his prophetic development and becoming a seer, his family work context, the concern for his immortal soul, his seekerism, reading of his Bible, praying in the woods, the fact that he never tried to pray vocally, and the fact that he was comfortable with the vision of Christ and his family would have been. Therefore, it's probable that Joseph Smith is relating an experience from the 1820s. Really what I see with critics around the first vision is a hyper concern with just this idea of an 1820 revival, and ignorance and not looking at the details, and because we have so many details here, and asking the question, does it fit that context? It's very similar to the book of Abraham. If you focus exclusively on the facsimiles and you ignore the text of the book of Abraham, you're missing out on a lot of material. All right. So our argument 2 is from inconsistent statement. Joseph Smith, again, left at least 4 different accounts. And then these accounts are inconsistent in the following ways. So this is just word for word from the CES letter. His reason for praying, right? So in the 1832 account, he said it was before praying he knew there was no true and living faith. His primary purpose was to seek forgiveness. In the official 1838, he said his object was going to inquire of the Lord, which was right. His dates and ages, 1832 account says he was 15, while all the other accounts said he was 14. And then who appears to him? This is a quote, a spirit, an angel, 2 angels, Jesus, many angels, the Father and the Son, are all over the place. Premise C, an inconsistent statement is a valid method of impeaching a witness. Therefore, Joseph Smith never had a vision as claimed. Right? So this is a classic inconsistent statement argument based on a witness. First, premise A, Joseph Smith left at least 4 different accounts of vision. This is actually totally incorrect. We have 10 accounts and 13 different documents, including his journal entries, his letters to newspapermen, and recording of others. And beyond that, we actually have even more accounts of secondhand accounts. So we have 10 kind of more primary accounts, and we have tons of secondary accounts from Orson Hyde, Orson Pratt, and others. With the full record in view, one sees that Joseph shared his vision with intimate groups, the general public, inquiring visitors, and newspapermen, and he did so spontaneously at their request. So even this first premise is actually false, but this is generally just repeated by well-meaning folks. Okay, so what about the claim of inconsistency? Again, this is a very unnuanced view of how history and autobiographies are written. Several factors undoubtedly would affect the nature of each of Joseph Smith's accounts, including the timing of his narrations, right? How old he was, the recent experience at the time a particular account was given, right? 1832, he's not going to be 6 years removed from 1838 and from 1842, right? So it's going to matter the timing, how old he is. The circumstances under which he gave the account, like right, group setting, public, newspapermen, right? That's gonna change things. The possible literary influences of those who wrote for him as scribes. We have many different scribes, and then maybe the extent for which versions written by others, so Orson Pratt and Orson Hyde, and specifically, may have emphasized points that impressed them personally. No single account tells the whole story. This is what is really interesting. But at the same time, all the details in each of the accounts add significantly to the entire picture. I would just read this article. I posted it here, and it's in here, the opening of the heavens. The first, like I said, is all the primary documents, and then there's an article which kind of provides a summary and a really good view of kind of putting them all together. So they go through what he heard, what he saw. I would recommend reading this. It's way too long to actually go through, but then they just kind of put together various elements and talk about in the 1832, 35, 38, Pratt, 1842 and 43, Smith, Hyde, Richards, White, and Newbear, which elements are present in each account. And what comes across is not inconsistency, but actually consistency. And again, we can go through, why he did it, what he saw and heard, the aftermath. So I find, like I said, I find these criticisms to be, they're not even taking into account all the available evidence, right? So they'll throw out a term like 4, and there's plenty more than 4. They show no evidence that they've dug into these accounts and really looked at them, which is great to do, and I think everyone should do that. So the claim that they are, inconsistent because one says he was 15 and then he realizes that no, he was in his 14th year. To me, it's not inconsistent in a major point. And when you look across the board, it actually, consistency is what you get from them. So there comes a premise C. This premise is really only true if the inconsistencies are material, right? So if a material witness says, I had this vision and I never saw God or Jesus Christ. Never happened, right? I saw just an angel and that was it. And then you have another account saying, I saw God and Jesus Christ. That would be an inconsistent statement that was material, right? Minor variations are to be expected based on just what we talked about, the timing of his narration. So in the 1832 account, for example, you'll see that he focuses very much on the forgiveness of sins. It's still a very personal theophany for him. He doesn't mention much about his role in bringing forth the new church and how everyone's wrong and he's going to be have this mission to restore. It's very personal. Your sins are forgiven, Joseph, my son, right? The Lord appeared to me. It's not as specific about God the Father coming, and doesn't obviously talk about touching the eyes and then seeing Jesus. So it's a very personal account. By the time you get to 1838 and they're preparing it for publication, he's now seeing it in the context of his full mission. So these things are to be expected. In fact, what would be more concerning is if he had the same 4 lines memorized and he said that at every point over the course of a 14-year period. That would actually be more evidence that he was making it up, because he'd be so concerned with getting it right that he would memorize those 3 lines and he would just spit that out. The fact that he gives it spontaneously and it's still consistent and it minor variations is actually to be expected. So premise A is unsupported. We have much more than 4 accounts, right? You need to look at all the evidence before you make claims. Premise B is unsupported. They aren't inconsistent. There's minor variations. They're on a whole entirely consistent, especially with the major things. And premise C is unsupported. Those variations are to be expected. Minor, like I said, if it was just a rote 3 sentences, that would be actually less persuasive. Argument 3. Again, we're not going to go into this. This is from the CS letter. I wanted to mention it in case people are really interested. He says, why did Joseph Smith hold a Trinitarian view of the Godhead, as shown previously, he claims, in the CS letter with the Book of Mormon, if he clearly saw that the Father and Son were separate embodied beings in the official first vision? What he's saying here is that the Book of Mormon, he's making a claim that the Book of Mormon prevents a classical Trinitarian view of the Godhead. Others claim, others more sophisticated claim that Joseph evolved from a modalism to a binitarianism. Modalism is the view that there is one being, right? That it's a form of Trinitarianism that says there's only one being. Binitarianism is 2 distinct beings. And finally, by Joseph Smith's death, a nascent cosmic henotheism, right, which is the worship of one God without denying the existence of other gods. Both of these theses are seriously flawed in light of all the evidence. So, that's supposed to be for more. If you are interested in this, is a great article that takes account into all the evidence of the Book of Mormon. It's called The Development of the Mormon Understanding of God, Early Mormon Modalism and Early Myths, available online. I don't want to go into it because it's such a mess, quite frankly, as an argument, and it's so off base, and most people have never heard of it, and so I didn't want to get into We talked about the Trinity briefly in one of our other sessions. Again, if you're interested, read it or email me with questions. It's not a major concern, but it is there. I wanted to make sure I addressed it without getting into full-blown Trinity debate. All right, finally, argument from priesthood. Very clear about this argument. Joseph and Oliver Cowdery first made claims about priesthood restoration in 1834 and then backdated revelations. That's the claim. Therefore, both Joseph and Oliver were lying about receiving priesthood. Here's how it reads in the CS letter. Like the first vision story, none of the members of the church or Joseph Smith's family had ever heard prior to 1830 about priesthood restoration from John the Baptist, Peter, James, or John. Although priesthood is now taught to have been restored in 1829, Joseph and Oliver made no such claim until 1834. Why did it take 5 years for them to tell the members? Number 2 is very similar. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery did not teach anyone to record anything prior to 1834 that men ordained to offices in the church were receiving priesthood authority. It's essentially the same claim. And then here's a claim: Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery changed the wording of early revelations when they compiled the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, adding verses about appearance of John the Baptist, etc. Where the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood in the hand of John the Baptist recorded for church prior to 1833, it would appear in the Book of Commandments. It wasn't until the 1835 edition of Doctrine and Covenants. He's repeating the same claim over and over in different words, but this is the claim. And that then they changed it. Make sense? That's the claim. He's just kind of repeating it. So how about this premise? Joseph and Oliver Cowdery first made claims about the priesthood restoration in 1834 and backdated. This requires that Oliver Cowdery is part of a conspiracy. Right? It requires this fact. Why didn't he expose the fraud after he fell into disagreement with Joseph when he was excommunicated and spent the majority of his life outside of the church and ran 2 different political campaigns in which he would have benefited greatly from distancing himself from the Lord? We went through this extensively in session 4 for an hour, and we concluded that his testimony is reliable. We looked at bias, inconsistent statement. All of this applies to his witnessing of priesthood authority as well. So please go back and review that if there's a question, but this requires Oliver Cowdery part of a conspiracy, and we looked at that extensively for an hour and determined that that was highly, highly unprobable. Furthermore, this premise is demonstrably false based on the historical record. The first written account that we have in Oliver's handwriting claiming priesthood ordination is in 1829. I'll read it to you. You can find it right here. Articles of the Church of Christ. I think I have it in here. A commandment from God unto Oliver, how he should build up his church in the manner thereof. I speak unto you even as unto Paul mine apostle, for ye are called even with that same calling. He's claiming that he's been called like Paul to be an apostle, which he should be called. And after this manner did he command me that I should baptize them. Now behold, these are the words which I shall say, calling them my name, saying, having authority given me of Jesus Christ, I baptize you. He's claiming priesthood ordination for the authority to baptize in 1829. And if you go through the primary documents by April of 1830, June of 1829, September of 1830, we have claim after claim after claim. So my issue here with folks like this is that you have to take account the full historical record, and it's very hard to take it seriously when you make these claims and all you do is write out that list of 5 things and you don't take into account what is readily available in bookstores and online. When I talk about it, it's hard to say that people are not being disingenuous. This is exactly what I'm talking about, because it's clearly available, and yet you're going to make this claim. Same with the Wesley Walters view in 1967 about the 1820 revival, and then ignoring evidence after that. So this is why, again, normal scholarship, you won't find these arguments. These arguments are only found online, right? Because regular scholarship is a little bit more careful than that. All right, we are right on time. Any questions? In summary, the arguments from the first vision and priesthood ordination are both very similar. It's that they were made up in the 1830s. One was made up to bolster Joseph's prophetic call. The other was made up in 1835 after the church was organized, apparently to justify authority. Both have significant flaws, mainly just from the historical record. It's not an argument really, it's just looking at the document and reading it. And then the first vision, as we talked about, just taking into account all of the available accounts, reading them, really studying them, And then recognizing that it was a first vision, a theophany that was personal and wouldn't matter unless we had all the other evidences and other visions that we discussed. So they're very much attenuated from the LDS truth claim that Joseph had plates and the Book of Mormon is a functional translation. Burning questions? All right, we're good to go.